So now, without further ado, we have Lukas, who's leading the SaaS product teams at Nevis. His vision is to make authentication identity effortless for everyone. He started his career in software development slightly after the burst of the last .com bubble. So let's welcome Lukas to the stage, please.
Thanks a lot. I hope you can hear me. It's one of these silent parties, it seems like, right? So perfect. So it's great to be back in Budapest. Haven't been here for a long while, so I'm really enjoying being here. I think he made the introduction. I don't have the headphones, so I think he did it. So without much further ado, today I'd like to talk about passwordless authentication. I know there are various different variants about it. I mean, we all received, I think, an email from Craft conference just yesterday already about this magic link thing to sign in into the app and the conference app without having to enter a password. Today, I'm more focusing to talk about, let's say, the banking grade passwordless authentication standards and FIDO2. Now, there is one thing, and this was throughout my career, there was always this message of, okay, 2015 is the year of the Linux desktop, and then, it wasn't, then it was the next year, and the next year, and the next year, it never happened. And about passwordless authentication, it's a bit similar. So I'm not standing here and saying, well, it's now, it's today, because I think the hard truth is passwords are going to stay with us for a very long time. Not only because of legacy systems or older systems, but simply because they're also user habits, and habits are hard to change. I think passwords are something that is ingrained into our digital society. I mean, we're teaching our kids how to create secure passwords right now. But how did it all begin? And how did it get here? So the first use of passwords, and this is actually even a Bible quote. It was one of the first written things, was 1100 before Christ, where they used shibboleth as a thing to differentiate between friend or foe. And over time, it was also used by the Romans, and also in literature. I think we all know, or many of us know, Alibaba and the 40 Thieves with the open sesame. So passwords have been here for ages and generations, and the legend goes on that somewhere in the 60s at MIT, they introduced a new shared computer system where they had to protect private files. So this was used by a few hundred people, not that many, that wanted to have some secure access to some of their files on a shared system. So Dr. Corbado and his team came up with the idea to use passwords to protect these files for their use case. This sounded like an awesome idea at the time, I think, and it was also perfect for the use case, obviously. And from there, of course, it took on. It was in the first Unix operating system. But then I think the next thing happened, right? So then the internet came and the whole thing exploded. And now we use passwords on things that were accessible basically anywhere. Previously, it was only, in local networks and for a targeted user audience. But with the internet, suddenly, it was everywhere, and you could access these systems with the same username and password idea. As an industry, I think we try to solve this in interesting ways a bit, with just increasing password complexity. And I think, we all have seen these overly complex rules and things just to push the burden of the security at the end of the day from the system to the users, right? And also the password changing rules and these things. Maybe a quick tip, so if you have to use passwords still, try a password strength meter or something and guide the user in the way rather than forcing something, because with that it's even harder to select a kind of a good password at all. Now, we added additional security measures in the end with two-factor authentication, and this was mainly also for banking, and there are many regulations there that even demand this. I think if you're looking at consumer space and things like Twitter or Facebook and Google, there the usage of second factor is absolutely low. I think I've seen numbers at Twitter, I think 2% there are using a second factor to sign into Twitter, right? And which is basically nothing. We have hardware factors. We have also for banking this card-based thingy where you can put in the banking card and have some challenge response things. But this was also to basically solve a bit the problem of passwords, right? So we've seen that, okay, well, it's hard to select a complicated password, but we need to have increased security. So this is where we are, more or less, right? So then something else happened. Somewhere in 2013, iPhone 5S was introduced by Apple with a fingerprint sensor. Now, Apple, as usual, is not the first adding, a fingerprint sensor. This was the first phones had it in somewhere 2004, but they paved the way to the masses. So the biometric sensors right now are everywhere. I think all of us do have a smartphone which is capable of doing biometrics. If you're buying a phone today, like purchase even a low-end one, it has a biometric sensor in there. And maybe a quick question, who here is using some form of fingerprint or face authentication to log in or kind of unlock their iPhone? Please raise your hands. So I'm seeing more or less almost everyone, almost I would say. So as we can see, it's also widely used. And I think this is what Apple helped to push into this direction. Now, another thing which funnily also happened in 2013 was the creation of the FIDO Alliance, with the goal of helping reduce these over-resilience on passwords. Their aim is to provide and promote simpler and stronger authentication. Initially, it was founded by PayPal, Lenovo, and a few other companies. In the meantime, basically all the big tech corporations are part of it, like Google, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon. Also, many government and industry regulators are part of it, like NIST, etc. Also, many companies from the financial world, like MasterCard or Visa, Wells Fargo, and many banks as well. And of course, also solution vendors like Yubikey or also like Nevis. Now, if you think about it, we have two things happening now if you fast forward a bit, right? One thing is we now have smartphones in everybody's hands and everyone has biometrics on there. Second, we have an industry alliance which is very strong with all these big corporations behind it and all the hardware manufacturers, etc., to promote simpler and stronger passwords. So the first three standards they created, and I'll give you a quick overview of them, and then we'll go highlighting and deep diving a bit into FIDO2. So one of the first standards they created was FIDO UAF, which was used as a universal second factor using security keys as a second factor with a browser. I still regularly use my Yubikey that I got from GitHub, actually. GitHub was also one of the first corporations to use this and enable users to use a security key with their homepage. So U2F is really focusing on browser and as a second factor only. UAF, which is the second factor and stands for Universal Authentication Framework, was basically leveraging these newly available biometric factors to provide not only a second factor, but passwordless authentication, because you can combine these things. This is mainly used with mobile apps, and many banks are using this behind the scenes. So the chances are very high that if you're using your mobile banking app or some access app that you have from your bank on your phone, that is using FIDO UAF behind the scenes to some extent. Now, FIDO2, shiny new version number, version 2, always better. It's more of a combination of taking aspects and things they learned over time from U2F and UAF to combine these into a new standard. So it's not necessarily a replacement for UEF, it's just combining two things. One, it's taking this everywhere available platform with the ideas of having this in the browser with the capabilities of passwordless authentication, and then combining this into bringing passwordless and not only a second factor to the browser. But how does it work in a nutshell? I'm using FIDO here intentionally because all these FIDO standards roughly work the same way on a very high level. it is based on very simple principles, and at the end of the day, it's public key cryptography, okay? So you have two things. You have a public key that is on the server. You have a private key that is on this thing called Authenticator. And the nice thing is that private key is tied to a specific app or a specific HTTP origin, making it even harder to do phishing. So it means if I'm signing in on example.com, for example, then it's using a totally different key if I'm doing a sign-in to example.net. So it's never the same key. So this kind of removes the problem a bit of phishing when employing these things. Because phishing often works with a way of, you're writing Google with 3 O's and these kinds of things. Now, the first thing the server does to start the authentication is it sends a challenge. This challenge is then read in a second step by the authenticator and then verified by the user. This means the authenticator is triggering some sort of verification. It can be anything. It can be here on Yubikey, it's as simple as me touching a button, right? If I'm using my iPhone with Face ID, it's biometrics. It can also be entering a PIN. What is used is actually defined by the authenticator, also what is available. So the authenticator defines the kind of methods that are available for user to verify this transaction. So after I've provided my face or name or fingerprint or whatever, the authenticator then signs this challenge that the server sent with the private key. This signed response is then sent back to the server, and the server can verify that, yes, it's this user, it's really the challenge that I sent, and it's signed by that authenticator, and you're signed in. So, as you can see, going back and through it, it's public key cryptography. You have a public key on the server, private key on the authenticator. And the other nice thing is also the separation of what you're doing between the client and the server versus how the actual authentication happens. So that the authentication methods or the methods like the biometrics are totally separated from the rest of the thing. So if in their future there is, I don't know, some palm reader thing or maybe iris scanning or whatever, this just can be added without having to change the server side at all or touching any other things. It's just the authenticator that is going to change. Now, for those who never have seen how this looks in kind of real life, I made a short video on one of our demo sites how FIDO2 with Face ID works on my smartphone. And as you can probably see then, I'm using most of my time to actually enter my username at the end of the day, not doing the actual authentication. Now this is the pop-up by the browser, so asking me to use my face to sign in, and I'm logged in. So this is it, right? So what you have seen here is really all these steps together. As I mentioned before, so there was a challenge in the beginning. I used my face to sign it, right? And then it was sent back to the server and it approved the login. Now, another important aspect of this is it's actually multi-factor authentication, but in one single step. Because it's something I have, which is my smartphone, I own it, the possession factor, and it's something I am, my face, combined into one very convenient single step for users. And what you have seen here, it works the same way on Android with Chrome, or if you use Firefox or Windows. So this is always more or less the same. Now I'd like to go a bit into the details of how you can control this user experience and security aspects of it, because FIDO2 has many ways how you can control what you want to do and achieve. And there are also kind of a few terms which I think are important to clarify. Because what I used here in this example was actually a thing called platform authenticator. There's a difference between platform and so-called roaming authenticators. And the difference is the platform authenticator is a thing that is embedded into the platform itself, usually by the OS vendor like Touch ID on a MacBook or the Windows Hello thing and these things. So this is the platform thing, what is coming with the platform. A roaming authenticator, on the other hand, is something that is separate, like an external security key. It can also be, Yubikey is also kind of an example, obviously. It can also be a smartphone or smartwatch, just an auxiliary device. You can enforce what you want to use. So you can enforce and tell when you start an authentication with the protocol, if you want to use a platform authenticator or such a roaming authenticator and enforce this usage. So depending on your use case and users, this makes a lot of sense because there are some pros and cons, obviously. So with platform authenticators, it's a seamless user experience, okay? You have everything there, you don't need an additional device, it's just there, especially if you're talking mobile devices. So if it's a mobile web app or something, you can be certain that you have this technology available. Also, you don't have to distribute any additional hardware. The hardware is already in the users, and I think corporations have a lot of trouble even giving keys to employees, I mean, especially now in the recent few years. So distributing hardware is not easy. Now, the advantages of using a roaming authenticator, on the other hand, is really you can use the same key for multiple devices. So I can use the same key to log into example.com on my MacBook or on my desktop Windows computer at home. Same key, I just use it, plug it in there, or use Bluetooth, etc. There are various protocols how these interact, and also this interaction protocol is actually standardized. And in some cases, an external or separated security key can also increase security because you have one additional thing even, right? So it's also something you could lock into a safe or something and to use. Another important thing is there's a difference between user presence and user verification. Now, user presence is really just about figuring out if somebody's there by touching a button, but it can also be by using a fingerprint or something, but it's not verifying anything else. It's just like, okay, somebody seems to be doing something with that thing, right? Usually you use user presence for second factor authentication. So this is what you would enforce and say, well, user presence is okay, because this is all I need if I'm using FIDO as a second factor. On the other hand, user verification, this is where you really have a PIN, fingerprint, or other biometrics, or anything else that verifies who you are. This is kind of the prerequisite also to actually do the passwordless authentication. So also here, you see, depending on your use case, user presence is sufficient, or you need user verification. I think especially with hardware and separated tokens, they often only offer user presence. There are a few keys out there that have a separate fingerprint reader as well, but not many do. On the other hand, if you use a smartphone as a token approach, then this is totally available. The last thing is discoverable credentials, are also historically called resident keys. Now, this defines where the actual credential is persisted, either stored in an encrypted way on the server. This is actually the default mode in FIDO2. So if you just start the FIDO2 kind of authentication, this is where it's stored by default, right? If you don't control it in any way. Or you can use it with storing that credential on the actual authenticator. This means, though, that the authenticator needs to have storage and writable storage and persistent storage. Here we see a screenshot from Chrome, and this shows also what is possible if one uses such a discoverable credential. This allows to actually even do one more thing. It allows to even remove the username from the whole thing, because you can just ask, please log in. You can have a button, you press login, the user sees the pop-up, they can select the account they want to sign in, they press it, then they confirm that with PIN, biometrics, whatever, and they're signed in, right? With platform authenticators, usually you have the possibility to create a discoverable credential, because there you have the storage, etc. Often maybe if you're talking hardware keys, this might not be available. Now, if you want to remember basically one slide of how to combine these different things and capabilities into a different user experience, this is maybe the slide, right? So if you want two-factor authentication with FIDO, so username, password, and FIDO2, just require user presence, you're totally fine, right? If you want to do password multi-factor with FIDO2, meaning username and FIDO2, require user verification, and you're set, right? Then the user, they type in their username, and then PIN, biometrics, etc., as the passwordless approach. If you want to go one step further, right? even getting rid of the actual username and want to do usernameless with FIDO2, then the only thing you have is FIDO2. You're prompted for the user, but for this, you need to require user verification and require discoverable credentials. So these are settings that you can set when you start an authentication or enrollment process. Now, I think there are also some challenges, of course, right? Because nothing is always perfect. And one of the things, and this is kind of one of my pet peeves, is especially if you're talking consumers, and Nevis is really in the consumer space, is the user experience is wildly different. And I'm not only talking about different wording or things. Maybe you noticed this add a new Android phone thingy. It's only there on Google Chrome. And I don't have it on Firefox. I don't have it on Mac. And also, it's not showing it for my iPhone either, right? Or another thing is like, if you're talking Firefox, there is no platform authenticator there. I can only use it on Mac OS with my external security keys, not with my Touch ID, for example. But Firefox on Windows does support it. So you can see the differences in between platforms and browsers, etc. That is, I think, one of the things that the FIDO Alliance is also aware and working on, but something that must be invested into to increase adoption at the end of the day, also outside, a technical audience or a workforce audience, right? Because if you're a company, you know the browsers and you know what they're using, and you can tell here's the key and use it. If you're talking consumers, you don't know if they have an old Android phone, I don't know, a Galaxy S5 or something, or the shiny new iPhone or whatever, right? So you have to be wary of that. A few other problem areas. One certainly is habits, right? And I mentioned this in the beginning. We are used to passwords. So if you're transitioning from passwords to passwordless, we also have to take the users along this journey, right? It's not something that you just is there and then people also can get easily confused or feel, oh, is this secure anymore? I didn't have to type anything. Is this the same security, right? So it's habits, and habits are hard to change, and you have to take them along. Downgrade attacks, I mean, we all know this. If you're having kind of pathless authentication with security keys and something, and you then fall back to, SMS as a second factor in password, then you're kind of allowing this to be a potential attack path. Another thing is often problem recovery, because these keys are, all these keys are just on this device. So if I lose this key, I have all my second factors that are on this key, right? Also, if this is broken, it's already very old, so it will happen at one point. And recovery of these keys and having them to re-enroll each time to each other platform is kind of a pain for users. Apple recently introduced a thing called passkey to kind of work around this by allowing to use the same FIDO key on all your iOS devices or Mac OS devices and share the keys, right? So between my MacBook and my iPhone, etc. But also this is only on Apple's side. And another thing, and this is mainly a bit for banking scenarios, on the other hand, there are many cases where you have something like, yes, I want to confirm this invoice or these things, like, so, and not only money transactions. So there are no transaction confirmations possible with FIDO2 because they removed this from the standard. It was in there initially, but they removed it recently. And maybe in the future it will be there again, let's hope so. On the other hand, as I said before, there is more than one standard. With FIDO UAF, you can still all do these things, and there you also can do transaction confirmations. Now, what's next? I think there was an announcement just beginning of May, a joint announcement by Apple, Google, Microsoft, etc., to expand support to also cover some of the issues I just mentioned before. One thing is the passkey concept is coming to all the platforms, meaning that if you're using Google and you get a new device, you have then the old keys, FIDO keys that you had on your old device, they are magically there using Google backups on your new device as well. So solving this recovery problem. Another thing which is, I think is great is they will make smartphones as a token, universally available on all the different browsers. This means I can use Chrome on my Windows to use my iPhone as a passwordless authentication factor. So all these combinations then actually work. So we have seen it before with the Chrome with add new Android device, so this would be kind of add phone or roaming phone or whatever, and on all browser vendors. And also, FIDO is created a UX committee already, I think, a year ago or something, or 2 years ago. Also they're doing a lot of things to also kind of unify the browsers and working with the browser vendors to ensure that it behaves the same on all platforms. Now, in short, I really believe, and also I'm kind of very excited about all the possibilities coming here. So passwordless is here, it's available on about 4 billion devices. I haven't checked this number, I took this from a FIDO slide, I think, the 4 billion devices, but especially with the smartphones, you have these biometric capabilities out there as well. The technology is here, it's working very well. I also believe with this announcement last month with the passkey support or general passkey support and using the smartphone as a roaming authenticator really helps increase adoption. Though, the bad side is we still have to wait for these features, so the official line there is it will be coming next year. We have to see what this means. One other thing, it's important to understand where your users are, which devices they use, the platforms, the operating systems, also the security considerations to select the right passwordless options, right? So if you only need second factor, then maybe roaming authenticators and just a touch is totally fine, right? If they're all on the mobile, then maybe you can really use the passwordless option as well. So I think this is very important, and thanks a lot for your time. Hope you learned a few things. And if you want to learn more and also do a deep dive, there will be a session at 11:35. I'm not sure if you're already over time or not, actually. But there will be more workshop, one at 12:05 and also tomorrow to get hands-on with FIDO2 and also FIDO UAF to try it out. So also if you have any questions, feel free to ask me while I walk around here, write me a mail, and maybe there are also some questions right now from the audience.
Oh, hello. All right. So thank you, Lukas, for a very amazing talk. Can you give me some love? All right. So like I mentioned at the beginning, we have Slido prepared for you. So as you heard the talk, maybe some questions that are on your mind. So please go ahead and go into Slido, select the innovation stage, and actually ask some questions. But before we go into the questions, I wanted to do one thing. So you saw that Christy is going to be doing that workshop. Can we get everybody to just yell, "Hey, Christy"? Can you just yell it out? Go ahead. 1, 2, 3.
Hey, Christy!
I don't think she heard you, but next time we'll do better. All right. So, cool. So we got a couple of questions here. You can also read here if you want. Yeah, so we're not looking up. So let's go for the first one.
I mean, good question, thanks. I think it's about considerations, and it's also about, as I said before, about different use cases and what you optimize for. Biometrics, I mean, depends on the length of your password, right? I mean, if you have, 265 totally random char password, then simply because of mathematics, that's probably stronger than biometrics, right? But this would be a very special use case, and I think it depends on what is your security model, what is your threat model, right? What are you protecting from at the end of the day? So if you have kind of fear that somebody is trying to create a clone of your face and do plastic surgery and these things, and they're really targeting you, then yes, maybe. But for 99 or 99.9% of people, I think biometrics are much stronger, because I think at least creating and remembering secure passwords is really a hard thing, right? And so that's at least my opinion. So.
All right.
So have you ever lost your keys? Oh, I still have time?
Yeah. No,
oh, cool.
I just want to read it for you so then you can have a little time to think about it. But yeah, so the next question would be, have you ever lost your keys? Had to go through the hassle of recovery? If yes, can you please tell your experience?
Luckily, only for individual services, right? So I mean, I lost my phone a few times, and then it was more like getting all these apps back there again, and especially with these banking apps, you need a recovery letter for some. So I think the recovery process is wildly different, right? So, some the more secure it must be, the harder it usually is. So there, in the recovery, we see this trade-off again, right, between security and usability. For those who ever had to recover something like Coinbase, like, of course, not the wallet itself, but the Coinbase account, they often also do something like wait for a week or something because they send you something. So to just allow you also to interact and kind of stop these processes.
That's one of my fears with these kind of devices if you lose them. So can you explain a bit what will be done at the workshop? This is an important one for those here.
Yes, sure. So we're going to look at 3 or 4 different use cases and just walk them through also more on the API level. And we're also going to look at how you can solve this with the Authentication Cloud, one of our products. So it's about using FIDO UAF to do usernameless, doing a FIDO2 authentication, and just trying it and seeing it, and also seeing it behind the scenes a bit of what is going on. So it's really about going a bit more technical to what you have seen and seeing this actually in practice.
Amazing. And the next one is actually something that I discuss internally too with my teams. How often do you change your password?
Rarely, but I'm using a password manager. So I'm having an ultra long password and using like totally random one by password manager. So only when I have to. And the bigger issue with a password manager actually is the password rules, right? So the password manager creates a total random password and then you copy paste it over and then they tell, yeah, you can't use, I don't know, exclamation marks, right? Or @ in the password. Then you have to manually edit the password to fit. So, but I rarely change them or only when required or, of course, when I get the breach notification. Okay, so if there's a breach notification, I also have this in the password manager, I'm notified. It's also this great website, Have I Been Pwned? Sign up there and you get notified if your email address is in some password dump. If it is, go to the service, change your password.
You haven't used that service? Very recommended.
One more thing to that.
Yeah.
And another thing is add a second factor. It doesn't matter if it's just Instagram or, I don't know, or your Gmail account or Yahoo account or whatever, but add the second factor. Even if it's SMS, it's okay, right? But this greatly enhances already over a password, because the problem with password is if it's leaked, it's being tried out, right, on all these other sites to see if they can sign in. And if you add a second factor, you can solve many of these already. Sorry, yeah?
No, just curious, how many of you use password managers here in the stage?
Yes.
Oh, amazing.
Technical audience,
pretty
great.
much everybody. Now, second question, who's using two-factor authentication for your primary email? Amazing. I mean, they're here for this talk, right? We should expect that from them. Amazing, good job you're doing. All right. I think we have another one that's not showing up the screen here, which is, are you recommended open source hardware-based keys? Do you recommend open source hardware-based keys?
To be honest, I haven't researched them yet. I can't, so I haven't researched the open source keys yet, so I will look it up though, it's interesting. If somebody knows more about this, happy to talk as well.
So we have another one, which is, I heard SMS verification can easily be bypassed by social engineering. Can you explain how that's possible?
Yeah, it depends on various things. As usual, I think simply because of time. So there are two things. So SMS verification, yes, it can be bypassed. There are SIM swapping attacks possible also. And the other thing is also social engineering. We can bypass a lot of other things with social engineering as well, not only SMS, right? So, I mean, being able to, pick up the phone, call the help desk and tell, you changed your phone number and it's still registered there and these kinds of things, and get them to change the phone number they have on file to something else. But this is just one of many ways you can do that actually. So I think usually the human factor is kind of the challenge, right? So this is also what I like about using biometrics, for example, because for us humans, it's very easy, finger, face, whatever, but the security behind it is actually much, much better than me having to, remember a long password or something. So that's another thing.
All right, so we have another one here around enterprise applications. Is FIDO already popular in enterprise applications and integrations, to your knowledge?
Yes, I mean, I think it's important to understand, so the technology itself, FIDO UAF, it was built for these big tech corporations. They wanted this to have it so they can, securely sign in their employees. So this idea of passwordless really grew out of these enterprise applications at the end of the day. So it's getting more and more popular. I don't think it's available anywhere, but it's getting there. So this is, I see also there was the FIDO Authentication conference beginning of the year, and this was one of the largest topics there.
So I actually had a question that's on Slido. Maybe I'll take the opportunity. Email authentication. So there's like, for example, Slack was very kind of famous for creating these magic links, which a lot of people are now attributing to passwordless. Is that considered user verification, user presence, or is this something completely outside of those kind of norms?
Good question. So it's something totally different, right? It also has nothing to do with FIDO. So I think depending on your use case, using something like the magic link is a great option, right? But it depends, it kind of delegates the security of it to how secure the email account is, right? So if the person's email account is using, second factor, especially if you're in Google or, I don't know, Microsoft or something, or especially if it's a workforce account, right? Then this can be an option to kind of allow these easy sign-ups and clicks. Also, I think at the Craft conference, we also got this email, right, yesterday. And for these kinds of things, why not? I think it's a good thing. I also don't want to remember a password. Actually, I'm sometimes doing this for myself as well. If there's a password and I just, type something in, forget it, and next time I use password reset, because especially if it's a service that I'm not using very often and I don't even want to have it somewhere. So it's basically like password reset. So this whole magic link, it's a password reset basically from the idea.
Correct.
I hope this answers the question. So
definitely. And maybe have time for one more question. So do you think WebAuthn will end up becoming the default way of authentication in the next 5 years?
This is the crystal glass again, right? I hope, personally, of course, because I think it's also giving the whole industry and corporations behind it, right? And the push that is there. Also, even making it more available with the announcement. I really believe we are getting there. If it's in the next 5 years or the next 3 or the next 10, it's very, very hard to say. But I hope that in 5 years, it's the common way at least, or the most used way. So I really hope.
Cool, amazing. So thank you again, Lukas, for joining us today. And you show a little round of applause again.
Thanks.
Show some love. All right.